Hey there, in this video, we're gonna be covering the only 4 ways that you can use compression inside of your mixes. This one concept revolutionized the way that I used compression inside of my mixes. Before, I was just using presets or just randomly applying compression, tweaking knobs until I thought it sounded better, and then moving on. This one concept completely revolutionized the way I saw compression and used compression inside of my mixes to ultimately get far more polished and professional results with my mixes. So let's dive into the 4 styles of compression. Welcome to Dinosaur Dog Studio. My name is Tyson. I'm a professional mixing and mastering engineer at Night Owl Music Group. If you are a producer looking to get more professional mixes and masters, then you're in the right spot. Let's dive into the 4 styles of compression and how this is going to revolutionize the way that you see compression inside of your mixes. All right, so let's dive into the 4 styles of compression here. So the first thing we need to do is cover a couple terms that you need to understand because I'm going to be using these again and again throughout this lesson. So the first one is transient or peak. This is going to be the initial impact of the note, or the loudest section of the note. The tail or the valley is the rest of the note. So basically anything that's not the transient is the tail. So the loudest part of the note is the transient, everything else is the tail. To put that in actual visual terms for you, the transient is this peak right at the beginning here, and then the tail is the rest of it. So this is a kick drum hit, so obviously a very, very fast transient, longer tail. This is relatively normal with every note. Even if it's a vocal or a violin, they're still going to have this transient. On those instruments, it's probably gonna be a lot longer, right, than a kick drum like we're looking at, but they'll still have these same parts of the note. The point of dynamics and the point of compression is to really control the difference between the two. So we're gonna control the relative change between the transient and the rest of the note. The only thing that truly matters with this in mind is our attack and release with our compression. So this was a revolutionary concept to me when I first learned this because I was so focused on the gain reduction and the threshold and the ratio and making sure that those were correct. When in reality, the only thing the ratio and the threshold actually do is indicate how intense my compression is. Because I was so focused on the threshold and the ratio, I was ignoring the attack and release. And the attack and release actually tell the compressor what part of the note we're actually going to be impacting. It's actually far more critical to dialing in professional sounding compression with your attack and release rather than the focusing on the threshold and ratio. Granted, those are important, but they're relatively easy to understand, but the attack and release are really going to tell the compressor what style of compression we're creating. The attack, we basically have 2 options. We have fast attack or slow attack. Let me define those for you. So fast attack is where we are impacting the transient of the note. And slow attack is where we are avoiding the transient of the note because the transient, right, is the first thing that comes up. And so that's what's going to cross that threshold, and therefore we're going to, if we have a slow attack, that means we're waiting until after the transient has passed before we start compressing. And the fast attack is where we start compressing immediately, and we are therefore impacting the transient. Release, the same exact parameters apply. We have a fast release or we have a slow release. A fast release means that we are going to be releasing and not compressing anymore after the threshold has been passed by the audio. So that means essentially that we're not going to be impacting the tail of the note very much. A slow release means that we're going to be hanging on for longer and likely impacting the tail of the note that we are compressing. So let's dive in. We have fast attack and we have fast release. What style of compression does that make? That makes thickness type compression. So thickness type compression looks a little bit like this visually. So again, we have fast attack, fast release. That means we are impacting mostly just the transient of the note, right? It's decreasing this transient, and by decreasing the transient, we're actually increasing the tail of the note. This allows us to basically create thicker, bigger sounding items inside of our mix, and ultimately it will actually be louder because obviously the tail is the majority of the note, and so if the tail is louder, it's going to be perceptually louder in the mix as well. Okay, so we're going to be using the drum bus as an example of how to dial in these various styles of compression. So dialing in thickness type compression is pretty easy, right? We're going to be using a fast attack and a fast release. So for the drums, because drums are going to be snare and kick heavy in terms of the transients that are occurring, we're going to be focused on using a very, very fast attack. I'm going to start with 1 millisecond, and then the my release will be around 20 to 30 milliseconds. Again, this is for example purposes mostly, just so you can understand exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to stick with a 3-to-1 ratio, just standard across the board. So you can, 5 decibels or so of gain reduction so we can hear what exactly this is doing. Okay, so here is without the thickness type compression. Here's with. So you can tell just how much more impact the drums have. The next thing I want you to listen to, I'm gonna do another A/B, is listen to the cymbals. Listen to how much louder the cymbals are comparatively to before. I use the drum bus for this example very intentionally because the snare and the kick kind of represent the entire transients for the drum kit entirely. The cymbals can represent the tails. So you'll notice after I enable this compression, the tails are incredibly loud. So AKA the cymbals are far more loud after this compression is applied. So here's without, and again, listen to the cymbals. So we can just hear how much those are brought out. Again, that's a good representation of the tail of the drum kit overall and how we can actually utilize compression to either increase or decrease the cymbal volume with actually compression on the drum bus. Granted, that's not necessarily our goal because we're creating just a thicker, bigger drum sound overall. And so this is a great compression to use on your drum bus. I generally combine this style of compression with another style of compression that we're gonna be diving into here in just a minute. So let's continue on to the next style of compression. Okay, so that's our first style of compression. The next style of compression is going to be slow attack and fast release. What does this make? So this is kind of an interesting one. This is groovy type compression. And the reason this is interesting is because when we're actually using this in effect, we are avoiding the transient, right? Because we have a slow attack. We're gonna be waiting until after the transient to actually start compressing, but it's also releasing quickly, and so it's increasing the tail as well. So what we have here is basically a dip in the middle, and so we have an increase in the transient, an increase in the end of the tail, but a decrease in the middle of the tail. So this essentially creates a pumping effect, and this was not the best example to use. A kick drum is a little bit harder to utilize versus a vocal or a bass guitar or something that has a little bit longer note length. Obviously, kick drums are pretty fast because it's just a transitory element that is being played. This style of compression is going to be groovy style compression. So again, we're just going to stick with a generic 3-to-1 ratio. And now we're going to be diving into our longer attack, but still a fast release. So we're going to be looking at around a 30 to 50 millisecond attack. And again, we're going to be leaving our release relatively quickly, around 20-ish something. Okay, so here is it without groovy style compression. Rather, I like using the drums for this again because you can really hear the cymbals. They're actually pumping just a little bit. So right after the snare or the kick comes in, there's a little tiny break before the cymbals just swoop back into the mix overall. So it's probably the easiest way to hear this type type of compression working, but generically speaking, you don't really want to hear your groovy type compression. You generally just want to feel it so that you can just feel there's more dynamics, because it's essentially creating space for the transient to make a bigger impact, but yet not sacrificing all of the tail like punchy style compression, which we're going to be diving into here in a second. Again, a great style of compression to use if our track is just lacking a little bit of life. Again, I'm going to do one more A/B, and I just want you to listen to just how much more life is brought out, because before this style of compression is just kind of generic. It just sounds bland, and then afterwards there's just a lot more feeling, there's a lot more movement inside of the dynamics, which then create that feeling of grooviness inside of the track. So here's before. The next thing is the fast attack, slow release. So what is this going to make? This is going to make normalizing or consistent style compression. So with consistent compression, we are attacking the note right away and we're hanging on. So the release is slow, so we're hanging on for the entire duration of the note. So this is going to create a more consistent experience overall with, dynamically speaking, inside of our track. This is the only style of compression that's not really focused on the balance between the transient and the tail. It is purely focused on whole notes throughout the performance. So this is essentially bringing down those loud notes and then bringing up the quiet ones after we use a little bit of makeup gain. Again, this is the only one that's focused on macro dynamics, not micro dynamics. Macro dynamics being the entire track's dynamics, micro dynamics meaning the dynamics within a single note. Okay, so in this style of compression, we're really going for consistency. And so I'm going to move the tracking head a little bit so we can find the verse, because there's a little bit more inconsistency in the verse here. Yeah, so we're just going to focus on this section because there's only the kick there, and we can just really tell where the kick is not consistent, and therefore we can really tell how much this compression can actually do. So let's listen to it again. So you can tell there's just, in that first measure, there's just some inconsistency. It's not quite, it comes in really strong and then it kind of dies off a little bit, then it comes back. So that's essentially the idea that we're trying to fix with this consistent style compression. So again, we're gonna be using a fast attack. I'm gonna be using 1 millisecond again, and then a longer release. Let's try that. My goal is to have the release basically get back to 0 before the next note comes in. Obviously, this isn't going to be perfect because at some points during the track, we're playing eighth notes. At this point, we're doing quarter notes. And so you can do one of two things. You can either just dial it into, the faster section, and then it's going to, work relatively well for those slower sections, or you could actually automate your release at different points in the song. It kind of depends on how specific you really want to dive into your individual mix. But dialing this in here first. Okay, so it's barely getting back again to that 0 point. Let's raise our makeup gain to about 3, because that's how much reduction we're getting. Oh, it's just so much more consistent. So here's before. Here's after. So you can tell those notes there's a lot less variation between them, and ultimately we have a much more consistent take overall by using this style of compression. The last style of compression is a slow attack, slow release, and that's going to be punchy style compression. So as we've discussed, the slow attack is going to be avoiding the transient, the slow release is going to be hanging on to the tail. So what we have here is an increase in our transient and a decrease of our tail of the note. So this is, again, if you want something that's going to feel more forward, something that's going to make a bigger impact, punchy compression is the way to go. Okay, so now we're on to the last style of compression, one of my personal favorites, which is the punchy style compression. So we're going to enable this, and again, And for Punchy style compression, we use a slower attack, so I'm going to back it off to about 50 milliseconds. Again, if this were a vocal, I might actually go up to say maybe 100 milliseconds because the transient itself will be slower, but for drums, usually between 30 and 50 is considered a long attack or a slow attack. Let's start dialing this in again. I think I was around 440 milliseconds on the release with the last one, so I think I'm gonna probably stick around there. And then let's start dialing in our threshold so we get some gain reduction. So as you'll notice, I was getting, because the drums were playing eighth notes here, it wasn't getting all the way back to 0. So I'm just going to adjust a little bit to try to get back down to that 0 range here. You know what? I'm going to keep it up, actually, because it's starting to create kind of a groovy type compression between those notes when it's actually just playing the quarter notes. So we're going to stick with the longer release there. Okay, what I want you to listen for in this style of compression is the cymbals again. Similar to the thickness style compression where that's increasing the tails, so increasing the cymbals, the Punchy style compression is increasing the transients, aka the kick and the snare, and decreasing the cymbals. So again, listen to the cymbals. Once this comes in, the cymbals are going to be perceptually quieter after this compression is enabled. Oh, actually, I forgot my makeup gain here, so. Okay, so you should have a perceptually increase of the snare and the kick, and you should also have a decrease of the cymbals. So listen to those elements as we're diving in here. So you can tell just how much more of an impact that's making with the kick and the snare. I would say that this is actually increasing the kick and the snare more than it is actually decreasing the cymbals. But again, this is really about that relative difference between the transient and the tail, not necessarily the overall volume for that particular track. So again, we're still completing our goal. We're making that transient louder, even if the cymbals, are probably about the same before and after. That's due to this makeup gain directly, where we're actually making up for the fact that we're decreasing it by that much. If this was helpful at all, then make sure you're picking up a copy of The Objective Mix. You can go to theobjectivemix.com to get your own copy. It's only $5 right now. For a limited time, it's not going to be $5 forever. So if you want to get your book, make sure you're getting it now. Again, this covers the 4 styles of compression plus my entire workflow of how I mix objectively professional mixes. So if you're a producer who's struggling to get consistent quality mixes, then you need the Objective Mix because it's going to help you get objectively professional results with your mixes. So make sure you go to The Objective Mix to pick up your copy today.